The Trump administration is radically reshaping America and the world around it. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr. Emma Shortis examines Trump's grim vision for America and the future of the Australia-US alliance. Pre-order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a Foundation subscriber to Vantage Point at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
What our election campaign is really showing is just how precious Australian democratic institutions are, and how, having expectations of those institutions is a really positive thing. The erosion of faith in democracy in the United States has done so much damage.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to this crossover special of Follow the Money and After America. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. With each passing day, the United States is disappearing further down an authoritarian path. The America we thought we knew is gone.
He is focused on launching the largest mass deportation operation in American history of illegal criminals.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done.
A federal judge says that he has found probable cause to hold Trump administration officials in contempt of court after the U.S. government violated his orders to turn around planes that were carrying migrants who were deported to El Salvador.
It's the latest judicial challenge revolving around President Trump's use of the 18th century wartime law, the Alien Enemies Act.
Donald Trump posting to Truth Social, essentially saying Happy Easter, including the radical left lunatics who are fighting and scheming so hard to bring murderers, drug lords, dangerous prisoners, the mentally insane and well-known MS-13 gang members and wife-beaters back into our country.
Leaders of America's traditional allies are having to navigate this descent in real time. And in Australia, like in Canada, it's playing out in the context of a federal election campaign. Joining me to discuss the spectre of Trump and how he's looming over the campaign here, as well as his administration's efforts to radically reshape America, is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. G'day, Emma.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Emma, news out of the United States has been pretty consistently grim since Trump was inaugurated, but it's been dominated this past week or so by deportations and some pretty disturbing footage of how these deportations are being done. One case in particular has really been galvanizing opposition to what the administration is doing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It is really grim, Eb. And you're right to say that opposition to the Trump administration's mass deportation policy is growing and has really galvanized around this one particular case of a man who was living in Maryland. His name is Kilmer Abrego Garcia, and he was summarily deported to El Salvador despite the fact that there was a 2019 order barring him from being sent there. There have been court cases around this, attempting to get him returned to his family in Maryland in the United States, but the Trump administration is so far at least not really complying with those orders. So a federal court asked the Trump administration to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. It's unclear exactly what that means. We're dealing, of course, with a labyrinth of a legal system and legal jargon, but the Trump administration, so far at least, has not facilitated his return to the United States, to his family. And opposition to that is really growing and has galvanized some political leaders in particular. So Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's a representative from Maryland, has actually gone to El Salvador to meet with Abrego Garcia and is describing what has happened to him as an abduction.
Depriving Kilmer of his constitutional rights is a threat to everybody who resides in America.
which is pretty extraordinary language. But, effectively, this is what the Trump administration is doing. It's deporting people without giving them access to due process based on completely made up, often, allegations of gang membership. So in Abrego Garcia's case, the administration has alleged that he's a member of MS-13, for which there is absolutely no evidence. And even if there was, it hasn't been tested in court because he wasn't allowed any due process. And that is what the administration is doing. It is summarily deporting people. So it is a pretty horrifying case. And as we said, opposition is galvanising around it, but certainly not the only case either.
I mean, before we move on to some of those other cases, part of the issue is not just this deporting people with lack of due process, which is obviously massively concerning for civil rights, but also, I guess, the process itself, deporting people to a foreign prison. And it's the kind of thing that we see in countries that don't adhere to the rule of law. And it's certainly unambiguously authoritarian. How concerning is this for, I guess, citizens in the United States that this will start happening to citizens? Is that the next step that we could see here?
I think it's deeply concerning, and we've seen a number of people come out and say just that, that the Trump administration is deporting non-citizens, but it's deporting people with valid visas, who are in the United States legally. So there's no reason that they couldn't do that to citizens. When you're not adhering to due process, how would it even be possible to fight back against a deportation if you're a citizen, when often these deportations are happening as effective abductions? It's officers in plain clothes, kind of loading people into vans and taking them away, which, as you say, is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. But this is what Trump promised. He promised the largest mass deportations in American history, and that's what he's going about doing, and ignoring, the rule of law in the process. And we've seen a number of legal professionals, judges, come out with really strong statements about how access to due process is a foundational principle of the United States and the US Constitution, and that the Trump administration is entirely trashing that. It is quite extraordinary, though it's not surprising, that there have been orders to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia, for example, that the administration is effectively ignoring, and there will be more tests like that.
Yeah, I was going to say it's kind of worse than ignoring it. They're almost mocking it. I've looked at some of what's been coming out of the administration's spokespeople, and they're kind of adhering to those lies about his connections to the gangs, for example, but also more or less washing their hands of it, saying, well, what can we do? We're not going to do anything about it. There's also been reports of a growing number of travelers being interrogated, detained, and deported. Just how bad is that?
It's really bad, Eb. I think it's really rattling a lot of people who travel to the United States frequently. There are just more and more stories of travelers being detained at airports. There was one just the other day about 2 German tourists, for example, who were going to Hawaii and were detained and deported, again, for no real reason. It was just normal tourist activity. We've seen academics be detained for hours and interrogated and then deported. There was a story in The Guardian last week about an Australian guy who had been living in the States for a really long time on a valid work visa who was detained in Texas. He described a pretty awful experience where he was interrogated by customs officials in a space where, posters of the agency, the Border Control Agency's diversity, equity, inclusion policies had been defaced and was treated extraordinarily badly. But, of course, they can do that. These agencies have extraordinary power to, summarily rescind visas, which is what they're doing to students in the United States, and to completely upend people's lives. So it is really concerning, I think, for anybody who's wanting to go to the United States, because it does seem that there is no, there's no real rule of law in place here. Those agencies have incredible power, and they are using it and feeling emboldened to use it against people.
And why is the administration doing this?
This is what Trump promised. He promised the largest mass deportations in American history, and this is what he's going about doing, and has always had this kind of, I guess, ideological bent about who is American and who is not, and that he and his cronies are able to control that and make decisions about it. And so that's why you see, we talked about Abrego Garcia's case where the administration is saying, too bad. Like, yes, he was deported as a result. They describe it as an administrative error, but they do not care, and that's because Trump sees political mileage out of this. He sees himself as having won the election off the back of these racist immigration policies, and he's going to stick to them. And he has a huge array of people underneath him who are facilitating that and who are willing to trash the rule of law in the United States in order to do it.
Obviously, those kinds of mass deportations and the really, I guess, on the one hand, sweeping up anybody and everybody in those kinds of things, including tourists and academics. But on the other hand, the administration's real willingness to target its so-called enemies, I guess, makes it incredibly concerning and is also, I'm sure, designed to silence critics of the administration as well. Are we already seeing some of those impacts that it is silencing people who don't want this to happen to them?
Look, I think so. You're right to say that this is a kind of terrorizing tactic, particularly when it comes to students. The administration is clearly targeting students, for example, who have been activists around Gaza and opposing Israel's actions in Palestine. We've seen a number of students detained on that basis and had their visas rescinded. And so it is designed to silence people, to frighten them. And I think, when you connect that, for example, to what the Trump administration is doing around universities, attacking the independence of research, what people are allowed to research, rescinding funding on that basis, not just in the United States, of course, it's important to say, but in Australia as well, where funding has been coming under attack. That is all designed to silence people and to silence opposition, and also to divide opposition, to make sure that people are kind of running around, we've spoken about this before, putting out fires that the Trump administration is lighting. So far, at least, I think it's been very effective.
Emma, I'm curious. I've been extremely horrified, obviously, like most people, by the deportations to this torture prison CCOT in El Salvador. But it also struck me that you could probably draw a pretty straight line between this type of policy all the way back to John Howard refusing to let refugees enter Australia on the Tampa part of that crisis, and how Australia really decided that we were going to export or offshore the issue of refugees and asylum seekers and really put them in squalid conditions, and that becoming acceptable to the body politic. Would you think that is a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And Trump has actually stated that pretty much explicitly. He has expressed admiration for Australia's border control policies before, and even highlighted the advertising campaign that existed for a while there about not coming to Australia. So certainly Australia has very successfully exported that policy, partly to the United States, to the United Kingdom, and parts of Europe as well. And I think it's a real example of how so often Australia's relationship with the United States tends to bring out the worst political instincts in both of our nations. I think that history, Eb, is really important. Part of the reason that the Trump administration can do what it is doing now is because of an already broken immigration system and a willingness, particularly on the left of American politics, to cede that ground to the right and really to attempt to kind of outdo them in the hardness and cruelty of immigration policy. And so that has facilitated, I think, what Trump is doing now.
Today, we are learning some new details following reports of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth sharing some detailed military plans in a second Signal group chat that included his wife, a lawyer, and his brother.
Yeah, and if this all sounds sort of reminiscent of that scandal that engulfed the administration about a month ago, it should.
Fresh questions about Pete Hegseth's tenure as the country's Secretary of Defense. A former aide to Hegseth now describing the last 30 days this way as a, quote, month from hell.
See, this is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people. and ruin their reputations. Not going to work with me.
The president stands strongly behind Secretary Hegseth, who is doing a phenomenal job leading the Pentagon. And this is what happens when the entire Pentagon is working against you and working against the monumental change that you are trying to implement.
We have seen that several weeks ago there was a huge scandal after a prominent journalist was accidentally added to a group chat with the Vice President, the Defense Secretary and others that included details about upcoming airstrikes in Yemen. But as it turns out, that wasn't the only group chat that was happening. Is that right?
No. So it seems that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has a number of group chats running. I'm not sure how he keeps up with them all, but it's been revealed by the New York Times that not only was Hegseth in that first group chat that you mentioned, Eb, he had another one going where he was also sharing information about airstrikes with a chat that included his wife and his personal lawyer, and the New York Times reported potentially a dozen other people, which is pretty wild to think about. So there has been, unsurprisingly, I think, a significant reaction to this where particularly the kind of old guard of American security is absolutely horrified at the sharing of this kind of information outside of official channels. There's been a number of articles about how the Defense Secretary Hegseth is now under increasing pressure to resign, not only because of this, but because of turmoil within the Pentagon and the Defense Department. Whether that happens, of course, is an open question. But you can see already how all of this is being normalized. Like that first signal chat revelation dominated the news cycle for a couple of days, which in itself is significant. But this second revelation, which in a way is kind of more extraordinary, that this information was being shared with his wife and his lawyer and, goodness knows who else, is already kind of falling off the news cycle. So, already all of this is being normalized.
Yeah. And it's just worth remembering like how far from the norm we have strayed, and that's how far they've already pushed things, that any other time, this would be an immediate sackable offence. Yeah. And here it's just a bit of it's already being brushed to the side amongst so many other things. It also comes amidst more sweeping changes to the State Department, which is the branch of government responsible for American foreign policy. And some details of some sweeping changes there have been leaked to the press. What do they say?
Yeah, so this is another leak, I suppose, as you said, Eb, where there's a draft executive order circulating about the State Department and a radical shakeup of what the department does. So a significant budget cut, unsurprisingly, huge staffing cuts, and a real shakeup where many of the offices and kind of sub-agencies of the department will be effectively disbanded. So particularly operations in Africa and, interestingly, Canada as well will be effectively kind of dismantled. And so the State Department is kind of in reports suggest that the State Department is in disarray, preparing for what this might mean. It's important to say that it appears at least to be a draft executive order. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has said that this is all fake news and it's not going to happen. But, we know it is. It's almost surprising that the State Department hasn't yet been gutted by the Trump administration when this was something that it promised, during the election campaign. It was a big focus of Project 2025 that basically everyone in a senior position in the State Department should be fired on day one. So, if anything, it's surprising it hasn't come sooner. But it will be a huge shakeup to American diplomacy and will only add, to the dismantling of USAID and the United States' broader role in the world.
I want to move now to the election campaign because you were in the United States in the final weeks of the presidential campaign. How does that experience compare with the Australian election so far?
I think I watched the first debate between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, and it was such a weird relief to have such a boring, actually quite policy, detailed, focused conversation that wasn't kind of full. Of course, there were some awful things said, but it wasn't full of that kind of underlying violence that the US election campaign was so marked by. It is so striking that we don't have that kind of, celebrity obsession, I suppose, that Americans can have with political candidates. And so that was, in a way, that's a relief, to have a kind of normal, boring political debate compared to what happened in the United States. I think it emphasizes really how different our political cultures are, which sometimes we underestimate. But it's been really striking to me in this election campaign, how clear it is that there isn't a huge appetite for the kind of politics that Trump trades in the United States. I think there were concerns that there might be, that Peter Dutton might go the full Trump, for example, but he hasn't done that. And it's pretty clear that he hasn't done that because there isn't an appetite for it in the Australian electorate.
Yeah, because it's incredibly unpopular. And I think that has really shifted in a very short space of time, if we're honest. Heading into this campaign, the polls were with the coalition. The momentum was with the coalition. Internationally, a lot of incumbent governments had fallen.
Yep.
And it did look a lot like Dutton was going to ride that kind of Trump populism wave into office. But now it's a bit more of a albatross around the neck of his campaign. And he has, I think, really tried to distance himself from some of those connections.
And I should add just really quickly that that's actually supported by polling that we've done at the Australia Institute, which asked people things like, given the choice, would they prefer a more independent foreign policy or a closer alliance with the United States, where more people chose an independent foreign policy. So I think our polling suggests that the ground is shifting, and that was done even before, Trump imposed these tariffs on Australia and the rest of the world, before that meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. So I think if we did that polling again, which we probably will do, that will show that the ground is shifting even further.
Yeah, so there's been a definite shift in sentiment amongst the Australian public, basically. Sounded like a good idea, and then we see what it actually looks like and decide, actually, no, thank you. The other thing I wanted to raise here is that obviously the Trump administration is really ripping up the rule book when it comes to its traditional allies, and Australia's leaders and other leaders around the world really just can't rely or fall back on the old status quo. Do you think Australian political leaders have really come to grips with this shift, and are they equipped to navigate this much more complicated political environment?
No, I don't think they are. I'm not sure there's even a recognition amongst political leaders in Australia of just how much things are changing. There has been, of course, that pushback against Trump and some pretty strong language by Australian standards about Trump's tariffs, for example.
This is against the spirit of our two nations' enduring friendship and fundamentally at odds with the benefits that our economic partnership has delivered over more than 70 years. Tariffs and escalating trade tensions are a form of economic self-harm.
But there has been an outright refusal almost to link what Trump is doing around the tariffs, for example, to defence policy, for example. So the Prime Minister has been really clear in saying that he will not link what Trump is doing around tariffs to the AUKUS submarine deal, for example. And I don't think that's necessarily a realistic way of dealing with the Trump administration. You can't necessarily separate what it is doing in particular areas from defence and security, or assume that, it will be reliable in defence policy where it is totally unreliable on economic policy. And I think there's a recognition in the Australian community that that's just not the case. So that is concerning, I think, to see that kind of refusal to recognise how much the ground is shifting when it comes to the alliance. And there have been a few moments like that in the campaign where you can see how much a total focus on the United States and Australian foreign policy has left us ill-equipped to deal with a quite different world. And that played out in that little kerfuffle there was about Russian connections to Indonesia, for example, where, a number of assumptions were made about what Indonesia was doing and why, which weren't connected to any understanding of Indonesia's history or its, closely guarded commitment to non-alignment, for example. And so, there was an embarrassing moment there for Peter Dutton in particular, where, all of that was missed.
You said the Indonesian president had publicly announced this Russian request when he had not. So was that a mistake?
It was a mistake, and I'm happy to admit that what we got from the Indonesian authorities in the reports, and the Prime Minister commented on these reports yesterday as well, was that the sources inside the Prabowo government confirmed that was the case.
And that's not exactly heartening, I think, when it comes to Australian foreign policy going forward. But I think there's also a really big opportunity where, we are talking, I think, more about Australia's role in the world and what actually makes us safer. And that locked in bipartisan consensus that we're so used to, where, the two major parties put Australian foreign policy, above domestic politics and kind of separated away from democratic accountability. I think that is changing, where independents in particular are feeling more empowered to challenge the status quo on foreign policy. And I think there's much more of an appetite amongst the Australian population, partly because Trump is so bad, because what he's doing is so dangerous, to really rethink not only our alliance, but Australia's role in the world more broadly.
I don't know. I feel like I've just been watching people who just refuse to acknowledge reality almost in this space. Maybe almost the hope that, well, he can only be in for 4 years and let's just kind of wait it out and hope we don't have to change things too much.
Yeah. I keep hearing this, he'll be gone in 4 years. And I just think that we really
what will be left?
Exactly. Yeah. We really have to
really
challenge
dire.
that. It's really dire, and I think the undermining of the federal government in the United States, of US diplomacy, of the US role in the world, like that's not something that the United States can easily recover
Bounce back from.
Yeah. And also, we talked much earlier at the start of the show about the Trump administration's undermining of the rule of law. That's not isolated to immigration policy. That's happening across the board. They're already making noises about changing term limits. I think there will be a real effort to further undermine the institutions of American democracy, of voting rights and issues like that. So the assumption that Trump will be gone is just that, it's an assumption.
Yeah, and we'll just touch quickly on that. I've been very horrified looking at the voter suppression kind of pushes that we've seen, including suggestions or legislation that would include things that would perhaps impact on women's ability to vote, because women who've changed their name in marriage, their documents and identification don't match their birth certificate, and really raising the standard of identification that you've got to provide. And Republicans just kind of hand-waving away any recognition that it could have this huge impact on women voters. Like, these are very consequential things that are being discussed and pushed. And it's very alarming, and it just seems like everyone's just hoping it will go away in the Australian foreign policy establishment for the most part. You've got a new essay coming up for the Australia Institute's new Vantage Point series, where you write about how the United States has again vacated the field in terms of action on climate change that you were talking about earlier. So tell me a little bit more about what this means for global efforts and what Australia can actually do about it.
Sure. Look, I think there's been a lot of hand-wringing, Eb, about the United States abandoning its role in climate action, by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, for example. I think we have to be a little bit careful about that, because that kind of assumes that the United States was a leader in climate action before Trump, and that's not really true. The United States has pretty consistently undermined global climate action.
A bit like Australia.
Very much so. Australia and the United States have worked in tandem, absolutely, in undermining international climate agreements. Australia's often hidden behind the United States in that respect. So I think we have to be careful about that assumption, while still acknowledging that the Trump administration is really dangerous for climate action. It's winding back all kinds of actions. It's opening up more gas fields. It's attempting to open up more oil fields and dramatically increase fossil fuel production and use in the United States. So that is a real concern. But what it also does is open up space for the rest of the world to take more genuine action. When the United States isn't the loudest voice in those multilateral organizations or, international climate organizations, there's an opportunity there to actually step up action. And for Australia in particular, in our region, there's a huge opportunity to change the way we operate in the Pacific in particular. So Australia's historically been a pretty bad faith actor in the Pacific, where Australian governments will go talk about our Pacific family standing shoulder to shoulder with Pacific Island nations and, genuinely listening to them, and then turning around and coming home and opening up another coal mine. We have a real opportunity to change that and to be a good faith actor in the Pacific, and to build genuine partnerships around action on what is the greatest security threat to our region, which is climate change. And so I think we can do that. Australia is a rich country, we can be a generous country, and we have considerable diplomatic skill when we choose to use it. But it is a choice, and it would require some political bravery, because it would mean standing up to the Trump administration in the United States, which Australia has not had a very successful history of doing. So it would be a pretty big change in Australian foreign policy, but it is entirely possible.
And it's certainly like Australia has played leadership roles in the past around a whole host of things. It's absolutely not beyond us. And as you said, this could be a good opportunity where the US is vacating the field for Australia to really step up. And I mean, partly that's just good diplomatic and soft power for Australia and our national interests, forging closer alliances in the region. You can see why it makes a lot of sense. It is easy to get focused or sucked into focusing on Donald Trump, but obviously Australia's relationship and alliance with the United States is a long and historied one. So I just want to finish on what some of the opportunities are here that you see for Australia, with Donald Trump causing so much damage and straying so far from the rule of law. It's a prime opportunity for Australia to kind of reconsider that alliance. But as you said, it's also a broader opportunity for Australia in more ways than one. What are some of those opportunities that you see for us to forge a new path?
Look, I think there are a number of ones, and these opportunities, it's worth saying, are really rare. Australia's foreign policy consensus has been really locked in for decades, really, and opportunities to rethink it don't come along very often. I would start by saying that, Australians are really concerned about what is happening in the United States, and that is, I think, pushing us towards a rethink of our alliance and our broader role in the world. But that doesn't mean abandoning the United States. I think Australians are really concerned about America because we care about Americans and what happens to them. It's not in anyone's interests for American democracy to collapse. And I think we can make that clear as such a close friend, ostensibly, of the United States. We can make that clear that the collapse of American democracy is not in anyone's interests. And we can use that as an opportunity, I think, to reframe our relationship with the United States away from those quote unquote hard security issues to a genuine focus on shared values, which is what our relationship is supposed to be based on. And that, I think, means focusing on democratic values in particular and really deepening the democratic connections between Australia and the United States. So focusing on Congress, for example, focusing on elected representatives in the United States and building those relationships with Australian parliamentarians, making the relationship more democratically accountable rather than something that is kind of negotiated in secret between men in uniforms, which is effectively what it is now and has got us into this position. I think we also have a real opportunity to work with like-minded political leaders and representatives in states in the United States. Australia has agreements with states like California around climate action that we might be able to focus on, building those kind of partnerships. There's a huge opportunity to support relationships between higher education institutions in Australia and the United States, which are both under attack by the Trump administration. Supporting research connections could be something that the Australian government could step up and do. And I think, there's also the opportunity that we've discussed for Australia to really step up in the Pacific and to work with like-minded organisations in the United States to do that. And Eb, I guess to zoom out, I just emphasise what our election campaign is really showing is just how precious Australian democratic institutions are and how, having expectations of those institutions is a really positive thing. The erosion of faith in democracy in the United States has done so much damage. And so it's so important to be vigilant about our own institutions. And in that sense, I think our election campaign has been heartening, in that, as we've discussed, there just doesn't appear to be that constituency for Trumpism and Trump's kind of politics in Australia, and safeguarding that is really important.
Thanks for joining me today, Emma.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ed.
If you want to read more from Emma, she examines how the Australian government can recast its relationship to the United States in the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press. It's a new seasonal essay series, and you can pre-order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a foundation subscriber to Vantage Point at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. And there's some pretty big savings for becoming a foundation subscriber. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 22nd of April, and some things may have changed since recording. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Insta and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.